The moment he saw the child's face, Sebastian Hale felt something inside him break in a way success had never prepared him for. The pen slipped from his fingers and rolled across the polished glass table, the faint sound barely noticeable in the quiet tension of the boardroom. Yet to him it echoed like a gunshot. Around him, executives in tailored suits continued discussing numbers, projections, and a merger worth over $2 billion. But Sebastian no longer heard a single word. His eyes were fixed beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, down on the bustling Manhattan sidewalk 43 stories below, where life moved in fast, careless patterns. He had been standing to sign the final document, the deal that would solidify his position as one of the most powerful men in the industry, when movement outside caught his attention, a small figure darting between adults, weaving through the crowd with the kind of reckless innocence only a child could have. At first, it was nothing. Just another kid running ahead of a distracted parent. But then the child turned his head slightly, just enough for the sunlight to catch his face, and everything inside Sebastian went still. Dark hair, the exact same shade as his own, the same sharp jawline, impossibly defined for someone so young. And the eyes, God, the eyes. Steel gray, unmistakable, identical. His breath caught as if the air had been pulled from the room. "Mr. Hale," someone said beside him, but the voice sounded distant, distorted. The child laughed, a bright, carefree sound that somehow pierced through 43 floors of glass and distance, and Sebastian felt it in his chest like a memory he couldn't place. He stepped closer to the window without realizing it, his heartbeat beginning to pound in a rhythm that had nothing to do with stress or business. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be. The boy paused at the curb, turning again, scanning the street as if waiting for someone. And that's when Sebastian saw it. Every subtle detail aligning too perfectly, too precisely. The way the child pushed his hair back with his left hand. The slight furrow in his brow when he looked confused. It wasn't resemblance. It was replication. "Sebastian, we need your signature." His legal advisor pressed gently, sliding the document toward him, but Sebastian didn't move. He couldn't, because at that exact moment, another child stepped into view. A second boy, the same height, the same build, standing just a few feet behind the first. And when he lifted his face, everything stopped. Twins. Identical. And both of them looked exactly like him. A cold wave swept through Sebastian's body, starting at the base of his spine and rising to the back of his neck. His mind, trained to calculate risk and probability in seconds, immediately rejected what his eyes were showing him. There had to be another explanation. Coincidence. Genetics overlapping in a city of millions. But even as the rational part of him scrambled for logic, something deeper, more instinctive, tightened its grip. Because this wasn't just similarity. This was precision. His fingers curled slightly against the glass as he leaned closer, his pulse now deafening in his ears. The boys exchanged a quick glance, then one of them smiled, an easy, confident grin that Sebastian had seen countless times in the mirror. And in that instant, a memory surfaced, uninvited and sharp. A night, years ago, before everything fell apart, before the silence of lawyers and signed papers, before Olivia walked out of his life without looking back. His chest tightened. No, he swallowed hard, forcing the thought down, but it refused to stay buried. The timing, the years since the divorce. The last night they had spoken without anger, without distance. His mind began to piece together fragments, numbers aligning in a way that made his stomach drop. "Mr. Hale," the voice came again, firmer this time, but Sebastian barely registered it. Because down below, the boys had started moving again, and a woman stepped into frame behind them, her hand reaching out as if to call them back. Sebastian's breath caught for a second time, sharper now, more dangerous. He couldn't see her face yet, only the familiar silhouette. The way she stood, the way she held herself, guarded but strong. And suddenly, the world he had built, every deal, every success, every carefully controlled decision, felt like it was balancing on the edge of something he could no longer control. Because if his mind was right, if the math he hadn't even fully allowed himself to calculate yet was true, then everything he thought he had left behind wasn't gone at all. It was right there, standing on a crowded street, looking back at him through the eyes of two children who should not exist. The contract remained unsigned on the table as Sebastian Hale turned away from the boardroom without another word, his silence far more commanding than any order he could have given. And within seconds the quiet confusion of executives dissolved behind him as he strode down the hallway with a pace that broke every rule of his usual composure. His mind no longer in the world of billion-dollar deals, but locked onto the image burned into it. Two boys, identical, impossible, and yet undeniably real. And by the time the elevator doors closed, sealing him alone inside mirrored walls that reflected a man he barely recognized in that moment. His breathing had grown shallow, controlled only by years of discipline, but not steady, never steady, because now the logic had begun whether he wanted it to or not. Numbers aligning, years folding back into memory, the timeline reconstructing itself with brutal precision as if his own mind had turned against him, forcing him to confront something he had buried under ambition and distance. 5 years since the divorce. Almost exactly 5 years. And before that, the last night that had not ended in silence or cold words, but in something softer, something he had convinced himself meant nothing once everything collapsed. Yet now that single memory stood like a fixed point in his calculations, unavoidable, undeniable. And he pressed his hand against the cool steel rail inside the elevator as the floors ticked down, his jaw tightening as the numbers matched too cleanly, too perfectly, making coincidence feel like a lie he could no longer afford to believe. And when the doors opened to the lobby, he did not slow, his assistant's voice calling after him faint and urgent, asking about the meeting, about the signatures, about the consequences of walking out. But none of it mattered, not compared to what waited outside. Because if he was right, then everything he thought he understood about his past was incomplete, and the glass doors parted as he stepped into the late afternoon air, the city loud and alive around him, horns echoing, people moving in every direction. Yet his focus narrowed instantly to the spot where he had seen them, his eyes scanning the crowd with a sharpness that had closed billion-dollar negotiations, searching, calculating, refusing to lose the only lead that mattered. And then he saw them again just across the street, the two boys standing side by side now, one pointing at something in a shop window while the other laughed, their movements synchronized in a way that felt too familiar, too close to something instinctive. And Sebastian's chest tightened as he crossed the street without waiting for the signal, ignoring the sharp honk of a passing car. His attention locked, every step pulling him closer to an answer he was not sure he was ready to face. And just as he reached the sidewalk, one of the boys turned suddenly, their eyes meeting for a fraction of a second, and in that instant something unspoken passed between them, something that made Sebastian stop mid-step, as if the ground itself had shifted beneath him. Because the child did not just look like him, he looked at him, really looked, with a flicker of recognition that made no sense. And before Sebastian could speak, before he could even form the question that had been building since the moment he saw them, the boys turned toward the woman behind them as her voice called out gently, steady but firm, and Sebastian's gaze followed, rising slowly until it landed on her face. And the world seemed to narrow to a single point, because there was no doubt. Not anymore. Not after all these years. Olivia Bennet stood just a few feet away, her expression tightening the moment she saw him, not with surprise alone, but with something deeper, something guarded, almost fearful. And in that silent second where neither of them moved, the truth hung between them, unfinished, unspoken, but impossible to ignore. Olivia Bennet did not step back, but something in her posture changed, subtle and immediate, like a wall rising in place of the woman he used to know. And Sebastian Hale felt it before she even spoke, the distance, the refusal, the quiet resistance that stood between them more solid than anything physical. And for a moment neither of them said a word as the city moved around them, strangers passing by, traffic humming, life continuing as if this moment was not unraveling everything he thought he understood. And then one of the boys tugged lightly at her sleeve, his small voice cutting through the silence with a simple question, asking if they could go now. And Olivia's hand instinctively found his shoulder, protective, steady, her fingers tightening just slightly as if anchoring him in place. And Sebastian noticed that instinct immediately, the way she positioned herself just a fraction closer to the children, not hiding them, but not offering them either. And it was not anger that struck him first, it was clarity, sharp and unavoidable, because this was not surprise on her face, not confusion, but recognition layered with something she had already prepared for, something she had expected might happen one day. And that realization hit harder than anything else, because it meant she had known, she had always known, and still she had said nothing, not once in all these years, not a call, not a message, not a single attempt to bridge the silence that had grown between them. And Sebastian felt something tighten in his chest, not quite anger yet, not quite hurt, but something dangerously close to both. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than usual, controlled, but edged with a weight that made Olivia's gaze flicker for just a second before she steadied it again. And he said her name, slowly, as if confirming it was real, as if saying it aloud might change what he was seeing. But it did not. She was still there, still the same in ways that mattered and completely different in others. And she answered him with the same calm tone she used to use when she refused to let him read her emotions, addressing him formally, not by his first name, not with any trace of familiarity, and that single choice created a distance that felt wider than the years between them. And Sebastian exhaled once, a controlled breath that did nothing to settle the storm building inside him, because now that he stood this close, there was no denying it, no dismissing it as coincidence or imagination. The boys were not just similar, they were reflections, and every second he spent looking at them made the truth more undeniable, more precise, until the logic he had relied on his entire life became something else entirely, something personal, something that cut deeper than any calculation. And his mind moved again, faster now, connecting details he had overlooked, the way Olivia had disappeared so completely after the divorce, the abruptness of it, the silence that followed, the unanswered questions he had chosen not to chase because it had been easier to move forward, easier to bury the past under success and control. But standing here now, that choice felt less like strength and more like blindness. And he took a small step forward without realizing it, closing the distance just enough to make the moment shift, the tension tightening like a drawn line. And one of the boys looked up at him again, curious this time, studying his face with an openness that made Sebastian's breath catch for a second time, because there was no hesitation in that look, no doubt, only a quiet recognition that did not belong between strangers. And Olivia noticed it too, her hand tightening slightly. Again, her eyes flickering between Sebastian and the children as if calculating something rapidly beneath the surface. And that was when Sebastian understood something else, something just as important as everything he had already realized. She was not just hiding the truth, she was protecting it, guarding it with every instinct she had. And that meant whatever had happened back then, whatever had led to this moment, was not something simple, not something he could resolve with a single question or a single answer. And yet the question still rose in his chest, unavoidable now, pressing against the control he had maintained for years, because the longer he stood there, the more impossible it became to pretend he did not already know. And his voice, when it came again, was quieter, more dangerous in its certainty, carrying not just suspicion but the beginning of something he could no longer contain, because this was no longer about coincidence, no longer about doubt. This was about truth. And he was standing face to face with the only person who could confirm it. The question did not leave his lips immediately, but it was already there, heavy and unavoidable, pressing against every second of silence between them as Sebastian Hale stood in front of Olivia Bennett and felt the last remnants of denial slipping away, because now it was no longer just what he saw. It was what he remembered, what he could calculate, what he could not ignore. And his mind moved with the same precision that had built his empire, lining up dates, moments, fragments of a past he had tried to leave untouched. And it all began to form a single, undeniable pattern. The divorce finalized in early spring, the months before that filled with distance and arguments, but not completely empty, not entirely broken, because there had been that one night, the last night they had allowed themselves to forget everything that had gone wrong, the last time they had spoken without walls between them. The last time they had chosen closeness instead of silence. And now, standing here, years later, looking at two boys who could not be more than 4 years old, maybe a little older, Sebastian felt the numbers lock into place with a clarity that made his chest tighten, because the timing worked perfectly, disturbingly perfectly, and the more he thought about it, the less room there was for doubt. until doubt itself became the only irrational thing left in his mind, and he exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting from the boys back to Olivia, searching her face not just for answers, but for confirmation, for anything that would either break the logic or seal it completely. But Olivia gave him neither, her expression controlled, steady, revealing nothing except the quiet tension in her eyes. And that tension told him more than any words could have, because it was not confusion, not surprise, but calculation, as if she was already deciding how much she would allow him to know and how much she would keep hidden. And that realization shifted something inside him again. Because this was not a misunderstanding waiting to be cleared, this was a truth that had been deliberately kept from him. And the weight of that knowledge settled heavily in his chest, mixing with something sharper now, something closer to frustration. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried the edge of a man who had spent years controlling every variable in his life, only to realize that the most important one had been taken out of his hands entirely. And he asked her, directly now, no longer circling the truth, no longer pretending he did not already see it, asking how old they were, a simple question on the surface, but one that carried everything beneath it, every calculation, every memory, every piece of logic that had led him to this point. And Olivia hesitated for the first time, just a fraction of a second, but enough for him to notice, enough for him to feel something inside him shift from uncertainty to something far more certain. And when she answered, her voice calm but quieter than before, giving him a number that matched exactly what his mind had already concluded, Sebastian felt the final piece fall into place, not with relief, not with clarity, but with a heavy, undeniable certainty that left no room for escape. And for a moment he said nothing, because there was nothing left to calculate, nothing left to question. The math was done. The truth was there whether she confirmed it or not. And he looked at the boys again, really looked this time, not as strangers, not as coincidences, but as something else entirely, something that made his chest tighten in a way he had never experienced before. And one of them tilted his head slightly, studying him with the same quiet curiosity. And Sebastian realized that this was the first time in years that something had truly caught him off guard. Not a deal, not a competitor, not a risk, but something deeply personal, something that could not be solved with strategy or control. And when his gaze returned to Olivia, it was no longer just searching, it was demanding, not loudly, not aggressively, but with a quiet intensity that carried years of unanswered questions. Because now that the logic was undeniable, now that the timeline had aligned perfectly, there was only one thing left that mattered, not the numbers, not the past, but the truth she had chosen to hide, and whether she was finally going to say it out loud or force him to confront it without her. Olivia Bennett did not answer immediately, and that silence stretched just long enough to confirm everything Sebastian Hale already knew, because it was not the kind of silence that came from confusion or shock. It was the kind that came from decision, from choosing what to say and what to hold back. And as the seconds passed, the city noise seemed to fade again, leaving only the quiet tension between them and the soft, restless shifting of the two boys beside her. And Sebastian felt something inside him harden, not into anger yet, but into certainty, because he had spent his entire life reading people, understanding what they said without words. And right now Olivia was telling him more by what she was not saying than anything she could have spoken aloud. And his gaze moved briefly to the boys again, watching the way one of them leaned slightly into Olivia's side, the way the other stayed just a step ahead, but still close enough to reach back if needed. And it struck him with unexpected force that this was not a temporary situation, not something recent or unstable. This was a life, a complete one, built carefully, deliberately, without him. And that realization landed heavier than any accusation could have, because it meant years had passed, years in which he had been absent from something that now stood right in front of him, undeniable and real. And when his eyes returned to Olivia, there was a new weight in them, something deeper than suspicion, something that demanded more than vague answers or controlled deflections. And he stepped closer again, not aggressively, but enough to shift the space between them into something more personal, more direct. And his voice, when he spoke, was quieter now, steadier, but carrying a firmness that left no room for misunderstanding. And he asked her why, a single word that held far more than it seemed, why she had never told him, why she had disappeared so completely, why he was only seeing this now instead of years ago when it could have changed everything. And Olivia's expression flickered again, just briefly, as if that question had touched something she had tried to keep buried. But she did not step back, did not look away. Instead, she held his gaze with a calm that felt almost too controlled. And when she finally spoke, her voice was even, measured, but there was something underneath it, something that did not quite match the surface. And she said that some things were not his to be part of anymore, not after the choices that had already been made. And Sebastian felt that answer settle in his chest with a sharp edge, because it was not denial, not exactly, but it was not confirmation either. It was something in between, something that pushed him away without actually answering the question he had asked, and that only made the tension tighten further, because now it was clear that Olivia was not going to give him the truth easily, not directly. And the more she held back, the more certain he became that there was something deeper behind all of this, something more than just a hidden past or a quiet decision. And one of the boys shifted again, stepping slightly closer to Sebastian this time, his curiosity stronger than any hesitation. And for a brief moment their eyes met. Once more, closer now, clearer, and Sebastian saw it again, that unmistakable reflection of himself, not just in appearance but in the way the child observed him, steady and focused. And something in his chest tightened again, different this time, more complicated, because this was no longer just about answers. It was about something he could not ignore even if he tried, something that pulled at him in a way logic could not explain. And Olivia noticed the movement instantly, her hand reaching out again to guide the boy gently back to her side, not harsh, not forceful, but protective in a way that made Sebastian understand one thing with absolute clarity. She was not just hiding the truth, she was guarding it. And whatever the truth was, it mattered enough for her to stand here, face him, and still refuse to give it freely. And that only made one thing certain in his mind. This was not over, not even close, because now that he had seen them, now that the math had been done and the pieces had aligned, there was no version of this where he could simply walk away and pretend it had never happened, not anymore. The air between them shifted the moment Sebastian Hale took another step forward, not because of anything he said, but because of what he no longer hid, the certainty in his eyes, the quiet insistence that he was not leaving without answers. And Olivia Bennett felt it immediately, the change in him, the difference between the man she had known years ago and the one standing in front of her now. Because this version of Sebastian did not retreat, did not accept silence as an ending, and that made everything more dangerous than she had prepared for. And for a brief second her composure faltered, not visibly enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for him to see it, enough for him to understand that whatever she had built over the years, whatever distance she had carefully maintained, was no longer as secure as she had believed. And the realization only pushed him further, because now he knew that the truth was not just hidden, it was fragile, held together by her control. And if that control slipped even slightly, everything would come out whether she wanted it to or not. And he lowered his voice again, quieter now, but far more intense, asking her directly if she really expected him to believe that none of this involved him, that two children who looked exactly like him could simply exist without explanation. And Olivia's jaw tightened just slightly at that, the first clear sign of strain beneath her calm. But she did not answer him the way he expected, did not deny it, did not confirm it. Instead, she shifted her attention briefly to the boys, as if grounding herself in their presence. And when she spoke again, her tone was steady but carried a weight that had not been there before, telling him that some truths came with consequences he could not undo, and that knowing everything would not change what had already been done. And Sebastian felt those words land differently than anything she had said before, because they were not deflection, they were warning, and that only made the tension tighten further, because now it was clear that this was not just about the past, it was about something that still mattered, something that could still affect the present. And one of the boys, the one who had been watching him more closely, took another small step forward, curiosity overcoming whatever hesitation he might have felt. And before Olivia could gently guide him back again, the child spoke, his voice soft but clear, asking who he was, a simple question that cut through everything else. And for a moment Sebastian did not answer, not because he did not know what to say, but because the answer felt heavier than anything he had ever said before. because standing here, looking at the child who mirrored him so completely, he could no longer separate himself from what he was seeing. And Olivia reacted instantly, her hand resting lightly on the boy's shoulder as she tried to redirect him, her voice calm as she told him they needed to go. But the moment had already shifted, the question already hanging in the air, unanswered but impossible to ignore, and Sebastian felt something inside him give way, not control exactly, but restraint, because this was no longer something he could approach carefully, not when everything in front of him pointed to a truth he had been denied for years. And when he finally spoke, his voice was steady but carried a depth that made Olivia's expression tighten again, and he told the boy his name, not offering more than that, not yet, but enough to create a connection that could not be taken back, and the child repeated it softly, as if testing how it felt. And Sebastian felt that simple moment settle into something far more significant than it should have been, because it was the first time that name had existed between them, and Olivia knew it too, her eyes flickering with something that looked dangerously close to fear, not for herself, but for what this could become. And as she guided the boys to move with her, stepping slightly to the side as if to end the encounter, Sebastian understood one thing with complete clarity. She was trying to leave before he could take this any further, before he could ask the one question that would force everything into the open. And that realization made his next step inevitable, because there was no version of this where he would let her walk away again. Not now. Not after everything he had just seen. Not after realizing how much had been kept from him. And as he moved to follow, the distance she had relied on for years finally began to collapse. Olivia Bennett moved quickly, guiding the boys along the sidewalk with a calm urgency that would have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But Sebastian Hale saw it clearly, the intent to leave, to end this before it could go any further, and he stepped forward without hesitation, closing the distance in 2 long strides until he was directly in front of them again, not blocking them aggressively, but making it impossible for her to pretend this was over. And the sudden shift drew a few passing glances from strangers nearby, the kind of subtle attention that comes when something unspoken but intense unfolds in public. And Olivia stopped, her posture straightening as she faced him again, the protective edge in her stance more defined now, while the boys looked between them with growing curiosity, sensing the tension even if they did not understand it. And for a brief second, everything held still, the noise of the city fading into the background as Sebastian met her gaze with a steadiness that carried years of restraint breaking at once. And when he spoke, there was no hesitation left, no careful phrasing, only the truth he had already reached, and he asked her directly if the boys were his, the question landing between them with a weight that made the air feel heavier, sharper, impossible to ignore. And Olivia's breath caught just slightly, the first real crack in her control. But she did not answer immediately, her silence stretching again, this time under the watchful eyes of the children and the quiet awareness of people passing by. And Sebastian did not look away, did not soften, because now that the question had been spoken, there was no way to take it back, no way to pretend this was anything less than what it was. And one of the boys shifted closer again, his small hand brushing lightly against Sebastian's sleeve as if drawn by something he could not explain. And that simple contact sent a jolt through Sebastian that was far stronger than he expected, not painful, not overwhelming, but undeniable. And he looked down for a brief second, meeting the child's eyes up close, seeing the same reflection again, clearer than ever. And when he looked back at Olivia, whatever restraint had remained was gone, replaced by a quiet certainty that demanded an answer. And finally she spoke, her voice lower now, steadier than her expression suggested. And she said that he had no right to ask that question here. Not like this, not after everything. And Sebastian felt something in those words strike deeper than the accusation itself, because it was not a denial, it was a deflection built on something personal, something unresolved, and that only confirmed what he already knew, pushing him further, because if she was not denying it, then the truth was already there, waiting to be acknowledged. And he took another small step forward, his voice dropping slightly, but gaining an intensity that cut through everything else, telling her that she did not get to decide what he had the right to know. Not when it involved something like this, not when it involved them. And his gaze flicked briefly to the boys again, making it clear exactly what he meant. and Olivia's composure faltered again, just enough to show that the pressure was building, that the balance she had maintained for years was slipping under the weight of this moment. And one of the boys looked up at her, confusion starting to replace curiosity, asking quietly if something was wrong. And Olivia's expression softened instantly toward him, her hand brushing his hair gently as she reassured him in a calm voice that everything was fine. But when her eyes lifted back to Sebastian, that softness was gone, replaced by something far more complicated, something that held both resistance and something dangerously close to pain. And for a moment it seemed like she might speak, might finally give him the answer he was demanding. But instead she said something else, something that shifted the entire moment in a different direction, telling him that the truth was not as simple as he thought, and that if he really wanted answers, he would have to face what he had done first. And those words landed with a force that caught Sebastian off guard for the first time since this began, because they were not just defensive, they were accusatory, pointing back at something in the past he had not yet fully confronted. And for a brief second the certainty he had built collided with something else, something unfinished, something that suggested this was not just about what she had hidden, but about something he might have missed entirely. And that realization opened a new question in his mind, one that was just as heavy as the one he had already asked, because now it was not just about whether the boys were his, but about why Olivia had believed she had no choice but to keep them from him in the first place. The words lingered between them, heavier than anything that had been said before, and Sebastian Hale felt the shift immediately, because this was no longer just about discovery. It was about accusation, about something buried in the past that he had not yet fully confronted. And for the first time since this began, his certainty met resistance that was not rooted in denial, but in something far more personal, something that forced him to pause, if only for a second, as his mind searched through memories he had long categorized and closed, trying to understand what she meant, what exactly he had done that could justify years of silence, years of absence, years of raising 2 children without ever telling him. And yet, even as that question formed, another force pulled him back to the present, to the undeniable reality standing just inches away from him, because one of the boys had stepped closer again, not out of defiance, not out of awareness of the tension, but out of something simpler, something instinctive. And before Olivia could guide him back this time, the child reached up and lightly touched Sebastian's hand. A brief, uncertain contact that lasted no more than a second, but carried a weight that neither adult could ignore, and Sebastian froze, his breath catching as he looked down, meeting the boy's eyes at a distance, so close there was no room left for doubt, no space for logic to soften what he was seeing, because in that moment it was not just resemblance, it was connection, something quiet but undeniable, and the boy tilted his head slightly, studying him with the same focused curiosity that Sebastian had recognized earlier. And then, almost without thinking, the child spoke again, his voice soft but clear, saying that his eyes looked the same. Simple words, innocent, unfiltered, but they landed with a force that made everything else fall away, and Sebastian felt something shift inside him, something deeper than logic, deeper than anger or confusion, something he had not felt in years, because this was not a calculation anymore, not a theory waiting to be proven. This was reality, standing in front of him, speaking to him, recognizing him in a way that could not be dismissed. And when he looked up at Olivia again, his expression had changed, not losing its intensity, but gaining something else, something more grounded, more certain, and he did not need to ask the question again, not in the same way, because now the truth was no longer just in his mind. It was in front of him, undeniable and present, and Olivia saw that shift instantly, saw the way his certainty had solidified into something she could no longer deflect with vague answers or careful words. And for the first time, her composure broke in a way that could not be hidden, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone passing by, but enough for him to see the emotion behind it, the conflict she had been holding back finally surfacing under the pressure of this moment. And she reached for the boy's hand, gently pulling him back to her side, her voice softer. Now as she told both children they needed to go, but there was hesitation in it, a delay that had not been there before, as if part of her knew that walking away now would not end this, would not restore the distance she had relied on for so long. And Sebastian did not move to stop her this time, not immediately, because something had already changed, something irreversible. And as the boys stood beside her again, one of them glancing back at him with that same quiet curiosity, Sebastian understood with complete clarity that whatever came next was no longer about discovering the truth. It was about what that truth meant, about the years that had been lost, about the choices that had been made, and about the question Olivia had just forced into the center of everything. Not just whether the boys were his, but why she had believed he did not deserve to know. And as she turned slightly, preparing to leave, he spoke again, not louder, not sharper, but with a steadiness that carried a different kind of weight, telling her that he was not walking away from this, not now, not after everything, and that whatever she thought he had done, whatever reason she believed justified this, he needed to hear it, all of it, because the truth was no longer something she could keep to herself, not when it involved more than just the two of them anymore. And Olivia paused at that, just for a second, her back half turned, her hand still holding one of the boys, and in that brief stillness, it became clear that the next step would not just reveal the past, it would redefine everything that came after. Olivia Bennet did not turn back immediately, but her steps slowed, just enough for Sebastian Hale to see that his words had reached her, that something inside her had shifted even if she was still trying to hold the line she had drawn years ago. And the boys sensed it too, their small movements quieting as they looked between the two adults, no longer just curious but aware that something important was unfolding, something that directly involved them even if they could not yet understand it. And after a few seconds that felt longer than they should have, Olivia stopped completely, her shoulders rising slightly with a breath she seemed to steady before she turned back to face him. And when she did, the distance she had tried to maintain was no longer as firm, no longer as controlled, because there was something else there now, something heavier, something that could not be hidden behind calm words or careful deflection, and Sebastian saw it clearly, the conflict, the hesitation, the emotion she had kept buried finally pressing to the surface. And he did not speak this time, did not push, because he understood that whatever she was about to say needed to come from her, not from his demands. And the silence between them shifted again, no longer tense in the same way, but charged with something deeper, something inevitable. And Olivia's gaze moved briefly to the boys before returning to him, as if grounding herself in the only certainty she had held on to all these years. And when she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than before, not weak, but carrying a weight that made every word matter. And she told him that he thought this was about numbers, about timelines, about logic, but it never had been. Not for her, because the night he kept replaying in his mind was not the same night she remembered. And that single statement made something in Sebastian tighten, because it introduced a fracture in the certainty he had built, a possibility that his version of the past was incomplete. And Olivia continued, her words steady now, but edged with something that had been waiting far too long to be said, telling him that after that night, when everything between them had already been breaking, she had tried to tell him, not once, not twice, but several times, reaching out, in the only way she could. But he had already made his decision, already chosen to move forward without her, without looking back, and the words landed heavier than anything else she had said, because they were not just explanation, they were accusation rooted in something specific, something he could not immediately dismiss. And Sebastian felt his thoughts shift again, searching through memories not for dates or timelines now, but for moments, missed calls, ignored messages, conversations he had cut short in the middle of negotiations, distractions he had justified as necessary at the time. And for the first time since this began, uncertainty touched his certainty, not enough to break it, but enough to change its shape. And Olivia saw it in his expression, saw the moment where his confidence faltered just slightly. And that was when her voice changed again, not louder, but sharper, carrying the truth she had held back until now. And she told him that by the time she realized she was pregnant, he had already made it clear that there was no place for her in his life anymore, no room for anything that tied him to the past, and that she had stood there alone with that reality, forced to decide whether to fight for someone who had already walked away or to protect what she knew she could not risk losing. And Sebastian felt those words settle into something far more complex than he had expected, because they did not erase what he was seeing. They did not change the truth standing in front of him. but they changed the path that had led to it, turning it from a simple act of concealment into something shaped by choices on both sides. And for a moment, neither of them spoke again. Because now the truth was no longer just about the children. It was about everything that had come before, everything that had been said and not said, done and not done, and the boys stood quietly between them, unaware that their existence had just rewritten the past in a way neither adult could ignore. And Sebastian finally exhaled, a slow breath that carried the weight of realization. Because this was no longer a question with a single answer, no longer something he could resolve by demanding the truth. This was something far more complicated, something that would force him to confront not just what he had been denied, but what he might have missed. And as he looked at Olivia again, his voice, when it came, was quieter than it had ever been, not losing its strength, but carrying something new, something grounded in the understanding that this was only the beginning of a truth far deeper than he had expected. And he said her name again, not as a demand this time, but as the start of something unfinished. Because now that the truth had begun to surface, there was no going back, only forward into whatever came next.